you've done more podcasts and whatnot than I have. So if there's a way that you would prefer to do things, I'm happy to kind of follow that.
Dude, I don't care at all. I'm a pretty chill, laid back, whatever happens. Sometimes I swear, sometimes I don't. Like I'm real laid back. I don't care at all.
Cool. Yeah, me too. I mean, it was almost like unintentional that I started this podcast. People were just like, "Oh, you keep bringing up these conversations that seem relevant to circus folk," and I was like, "Well,
that's how mine happened." That's exactly how mine happened. I was just like, I should probably record this. This is pretty cool. Like, this person's smart.
Yeah, like I can learn from this person, and a lot of other people probably could too.
Exactly. Yeah, and also like I get this question a lot. Like maybe we should put this online somewhere so I don't have to keep typing dissertation responses in emails. Not that I don't mind answering emails, but I'm like, I think we have a common question here.
So and yeah, as you get busier, your time gets more precious.
Yeah, I mean, especially as more research picks up and we have more bigger projects that require time of like you really got to like shut everything down and just like stare at a textbook for a couple hours. So it's just that stuff is where the real change happens. So I'm trying to put more time into that, and then more time into not working 80 to 90 hours a week. So
yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that you sometimes work 80 or 90 hours a week.
It's not my favorite thing.
Yeah, a lot of physical therapists work a lot.
Yeah, it's the double-edged sword of being a kind of a more giving, kind, empathetic person is you always want to help someone and do above and beyond, and so like it comes with the territory. But it's all good. Yeah. I don't mind it. I don't mind it at all. You know what I mean? Like it's if I signed up for it. You know what I mean? It's, nobody signed the dotted line but me. So, but the goal is to hopefully get less and less of that as things progress, to not have to be always buried by 80 to 90 hour work weeks.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some questions.
Sure. Fire away.
Because I think you've done both a lot of research and dialogue into kind of the gymnastics culture, and also into the training practices around that. And at least from my limited perspective, there's a lot of overlap between those elements and circus training and circus culture.
Yep.
If you're open to it, I would love to start with just kind of your perspective on kind of coaching styles for high level gymnastics, and then how those impact health outcomes and skill acquisition outcomes potentially. And I know there's an article that you like to reference, which I definitely don't remember the author off the top of my head, but I checked it out beforehand, and yeah, it's definitely super interesting. But yeah, what are your thoughts on kind of ideal coaching styles, not just for kind of youth, because gymnastics has a more structured like youth program than circus does a lot of the time, but just in general? Yeah.
Well, first, Aaron, thanks for the podcast and asking me to come on and ask some questions. I'm always flattered that people even give a crap about what I do and my opinion. So that's very good. And believe it or not, like it's not really talked about as much because my podcast is mostly geared towards gymnastics, but I actually treat a ton of circus people. Circus athletes and kind of just people who are recreational with circuit, like professional and not, like a couple of my friends in circ, and I've worked with people in circ before. So at Champion, at our clinic, there's a couple of circus schools and academies around in the tri-state area. So I actually see a ton of them. And so I'm vaguely familiar, more so than I am with gymnastics. I don't know the ins and outs as much with terminology, but I've definitely helped a fair amount. So I think the conversation is probably more related than it is. And I think the author in the paper you're referring to is the British Journal of Sports Medicine one, the coaching style, dictator versus transformative, and like that kind of stuff. Yeah, that was a super interesting study. And for people that are not familiar with that, I think it was by X-Strand in 2016 or 17, but essentially what they did is they surveyed the medical doctors from, I think, like 26 elite football clubs around Europe. And they asked them what the opinion was of the coach that led up that team. And, is it more of like a dictatorship type style? Is it more of a transformative, being kind of what we think about as more that militaristic hardcore versus maybe that more like open-minded, what do you think, like team over individual, that kind of stuff. And there's definitely a lot of bias in that study because it's a subjective opinion of the medical doctors and the team, right, about someone's approach to how they coach. So keep that with a grain of salt. But what they found in that study is there was a significant correlation between people who are more dictatorship type style and more kind of militaristic or more harsh as you would probably think about it in the layperson, towards more time missed from practice and more higher injury rates, both acute and overuse, and overall dissatisfaction with progress from a performance point of view. And so that was, for me, was very eye-opening, because obviously in the gymnastics world, there is quite a historical moment we're living through, where there's a large opening of Pandora's box to a lot of inappropriate things that have happened in the last 20 years that, if I'm honest, we always knew were there, and people have tried to speak up against it, but they got blackballed or they got pushed to the side because it started to interfere with money and status and medals and power. And so it got swept under the rug. But we've gotten to a levee point now where, maybe with the pandemic and more time around these issues, but also the scandal we had here in the States, and then also the Athlete A film, which is phenomenal, with Jennifer Say and the other producers from Netflix, that really forced people to open their eyes and gave a lot of athletes the air cover to come out and speak about their stories with the Gymnastics Alliance movement, which is the best thing I've ever seen happen to the sport. Thankfully, it's painful right now, as it should be, because we deserve to some people deserve to atone for their sins in a way, you know what I mean? But I think what it has led a conversation to is, what is the fine line between coaching styles and pushing performance and getting the most out of an athlete's potential to health and wellness? Is how much collateral damage is acceptable for someone's performance if they have mental and physical? And I personally think none. I think that there's a very fine line between accepting high-level athletics and performance and the reality that it's hard and it's going to hurt and you're going to have injuries and it's stressful and it has a big mental and emotional toll. That's the reality of any sport, but also high-level sport, especially with elite athletes, depending on what, any sport you're talking about. But that is a far cry from attacking the human as a person and degrading them and breaking them down and thinking that the only way to maximize their performance is to bully them and berate them and make them feel like trash. And I think that's unfortunately what a lot of coaches were taught from watching the Carolis and watching some other people, is that the only way to reach elite level performance is to break the athlete and rebuild them back up, or just push them to the outer threshold of their capacity, and on a way that is immoral and clearly crosses the line of how you treat another human being. And so I think that's what we're seeing, is that, one, there has been a massive amount of problems. It's not all coaches. It's actually a minority. I would say there's a million great coaches, great athletes, great parents who are doing the exact thing right. But I think that those have been overshadowed by the louder negative people who are bullies and who are, honestly, when you look deeper, are insecure and have an ego and are fearful of social judgment and have their own fears and demons they don't want to face. And so they live vicariously through the athlete, or they take it out on the athlete, or they think that because they don't win a meet or because the kid doesn't get a medal, that their coaching status is gone and their own personal insecurities bleed out. And so that's what happened. But on the flip side, what you're also seeing now are thousands of examples of incredible coaches who do the right thing, don't push the kids at a young age, don't berate the athletes and yell at them. They're actually building a trustful relationship. And the number one example I always bring up is my buddy Nick Ruddock, who works in the UK. He's a great example of someone who has been a great transformative leader. He's led athletes to the international stage, but he's also consulted with 21 gymnastics countries. And he's a great example of someone who does exactly the right thing. But there's countless other examples too. There's, here in the States, we have Amy Borman, who is Simone Biles' coach, and she clearly had success,
Yeah,
but she's the definition of a partnership and a professional relationship, that you work together, you treat the athlete well, you take care of them, and you do what's best for the athlete's health and wellness. And clearly Simone is an outlier genetically and also as her talent level, but there's no way that Simone would have reached her peak and been safe throughout all of her years of elite gymnastics if it wasn't for Amy being so caring and so kind and standing up to some of these people on the national level who clearly were pushing their own interest and agenda, and they maybe would have put Simone's health in the way. And so I had a fortunate opportunity to talk with Amy for a long time about her coaching style and her practices, and she's a clear example of someone who doesn't need that. And there's many, many more. There's many great college coaches. There's many other great elite coaches that we see. All of the superstars you see in gymnastics, there's examples of people who are amazing human beings and are getting athletes to senior elite levels multiple times over and over. So I think the myth of the hardcore coaching style is dying, rightfully so, because it's inappropriate and it's unethical. And those people who refuse to change either will be asked to leave the sport, and if they don't change or leave, they will be forced to leave the sport in the next 5 years. So that's the way it should be. There should be an ethical code and moral standard, and nobody is better when they're getting crapped on all day long and they're getting berated. Nobody's performance is better. There's some athletes, I've talked to people like John Horton and some other guys who enjoy that tougher mentality, right? And they kind of like that edgy in your face, like go now. But again, I'm good friends with his coach, Tom Meadows, and he said that he's never, attacked John as a human. He's pushed his personality style, and he understands his athlete well. And so Tom is one of the nicest guys ever, and he's had a guy on the Olympic team the last 4 quads. So he's clearly doing something well, right? But like, even though John is probably the extreme end of intense, and he likes that kind of hardcore discipline method, you can still achieve that personality style coaching relationship without berating someone.
Yeah. And I think there hasn't been as much of that in the circus world, just because I think gymnastics has had at least in the United States, a broader base of youth kind of going through programs into high-level competitiveness, whereas in the States, circus traditionally has either been in circus families or now is exploding, but people are getting into it at a later age, so there's less of that element of potential for coaching kids in a kind of dictatorial way earlier on. That said, I think what you're saying in terms of, coaches needing to let go of their ego in relation to the success and kind of performance of their athletes is one of the most crucial things to coaching across the board of any sport.
Sure.
Like as a coach, your self-worth is not tied to the success of your athletes. Yeah. And if you are making it so, you're going to treat them as a means to your end rather than supporting them to facilitate the best that they can do.
Right.
Yeah.
And from my experiences and the little that I have, I've interacted with a lot of circus athletes, but not the coaches themselves as much, because again, you're talking about adults. I work with mostly adults in circus who are taking care of their own health. They're paying their own bills. They're coming to PT or whatever else it is. But I still have heard many stories of not so much like the youth athlete pushing, but more so just like a very large callousness towards their complaints or a callousness towards their start of injuries or concerns or performances. And I've definitely seen the transference. I've seen this from gymnastics to circus, gymnastics to ballet, and then gymnastics to other sports like cheerleading, where gymnastics is used as this standard against the harsher mentality and the harsher approach to physical training, especially with flexibility training, especially with skill volume and how many repetitions you do per day. And I see the same parallels in terms of the Eastern Bloc influence of just do it, stop being a baby, stop complaining, right? And the very large lack of evidence-based, science-based influence to use your decision training. So while it may not be as inherent as a power dynamic as you have with a youth athlete and an older coach, I definitely still have heard a lot of that harsh, calloused mentality. And again, this goes back to what you said is, when you dig down to the layers of why this is happening, there is either a couple things. One is there's just a pure lack of education, which is honestly why I'm still working so hard and I have a company built around it. Because I think the majority of people are well-intentioned. They just got not great education. They got, a weekend course on some shoddy science, and, they were like, okay, this seems like it works, and then they don't.
I'm ready.
Yeah, exactly. Right. They don't realize that there's much more complexity to that, and that the science changes at a blistering pace. And so for most people, they just need better education, or they need guidance, or maybe they need understanding. And there's not a single person listening to this podcast or working in sports that ever has gone through the transformation of thinking they knew it all, getting slapped in the face by life, and then realizing they don't know it all. So like, we've all gone through that. I've gone through that. And I feel like that's my skill set is I'm a nerd, and I can share some of that information with people in a lay terminology. So there is that one subset, but there's another subset, a minority again, of coaches who, as we talked about, it really comes down to their own ego, right? And one layer deeper than that is an ego is driven by insecurity and fear. So maybe their job is tied to the circus, school they're in, or maybe their status as a coach. They wrongly put their own self-worth inside the status of their athletes, of how well they do or what's going on. And again, one layer deeper is they haven't had the courage, or they haven't taken the time to deal with the emotional weight of what's going on in their life, whether it's I'm scared of social judgment. I'm scared of social rejection. I'm scared of not having enough money. I'm scared of not being able to take care of my family. Like the deeper level stuff that, we all know mental health is a big stigma and people all have these problems, but nobody wants to deal with it. But those are the real reasons why on the surface level, in my world, you see a coach flipping out, screaming at an 8-year-old because they can't do a gymnastics skill. It's like, bro, do you really care that much about this kip? You know what I mean? And on your end, that's probably why you see coaches who just almost shut down and have a reflexive callousness to handle injuries because they're just like, puh, get out of here. Like, you're not good enough for me. Like, you're weak. You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff. And it really comes down to think about how much. First, I always make this joke with the girls that I coach on social media about like trolls, and they deal a lot with like social anxiety around social media. But on a surface level, people think about how much somebody is hurting and how in a bad place they have to be in their life for them to crap on an 8-year-old, to yell at an 8-year-old, right? Or for a coach in your world to scream at someone because they're not doing something well, because they're hurt and it's an injury they can't control. Like, what's going on at night at their house when they're by themselves, in their head, for them to have that much of a whiplash effect on their day-to-day life interactions? Like, it's crazy. So I try to have empathy for people about like, clearly, if you're yelling at an 8-year-old or if you're screaming at your student in a circus class, you have some deeper demons that you need to deal with. And I've been through some of my own, so I know what you're going through. But at the same time, that's never acceptable. And you either change or we're going to leave. This is the end of the conversation. So that's just a small rant on that.
I mean, I'm 100% on board. I think, like you said, there's a lot that can be going on behind the scenes that we don't know about, and that can be like totally valid. Like in gymnastics and in circus, you don't really get paid a lot as a coach in a lot of instances.
Yes.
Especially at like, the level of like a local gym, et cetera. You're teaching like a few classes a week or, working with a youth group. And so, yeah, for sure. I can understand feeling like stressed out about that. But like you said, if you're yelling at an 8-year-old, there's some self-reflection that needs to be done.
Yeah. And I can definitely understand now more than ever the influence of financial insecurity and, gyms cloning coronavirus, and the gym might be at risk of going under. You don't have money. You don't have financial. You're worried about when the next paycheck is coming. Like, I get it, man. Like, our gym is literally going through the exact same right now. And I went through the same thing, right? I had to go on unemployment for a couple months because our clinic shut down and I was making no money. Yeah, it wasn't my favorite thing to do, and I was worried about that, but it's better than risking getting coronavirus and infecting my family and all my people. And so, like, yeah, that sucks. We thought our gym was going to shut down for sure. And I was like, this is terrifying. I'm scared that the whole thing we've worked through is going to go under. But I can't hide behind that and use that as an excuse to be a monster and take it out on the kids or take it out on my coworkers or take it out on the staff that I work. It's just like, yes, you cannot control what happens to you, right? But on the other side, you can control how you react to it. So on one hand, you have to completely accept. I heard this from Ryan Holiday on a podcast this morning while I was working out, so it's stuck in my head. On one hand, you can't accept. On one hand, you have to radically accept what's happening to you. It sucks. It is what it is. But in the same token, on the other hand, you have to realize that you are ultimately in control of writing your own story. So your choice to either, Jocko Willink said, shake your fists at the sky and complain and whine and be upset. Like, yes, feel what you feel. Be upset. You're allowed to be upset. You're a human. But there's a difference between allowing yourself a 3 to 7 day window to feel like that and a 3 to 7 month window to feel like that, where you're just buried by the world and you lay down and just let yourself get crushed, right? So like, you choose, back to our original conversation of when you're hitting frustrations where you can't get an athlete's shoulders more flexible, or you don't know why they don't have this skill, or you're frustrated with the performance always falling through and them not living up to what you guys train for. You can be upset and disappointed with that outcome, but your choice to do something about it, or just go back to what you've always done and do the exact same stuff over and over again, or not put in the time and effort to figure out why it's not working and instead just say, we'll just do 30 more of those things over and over and over and over again until you get it right. That's your choice, right? And I think a lot of coaches, including myself as a younger coach, hid behind the victim mentality of like, oh, well, I got bad education, or this person never listens, or they're not dedicated, or I don't have money to pay for research, or I can't afford going to a course, or coronavirus, or the president, or whatever. Like a billion different excuses you can live behind. Or you can just handle it and you can be like, this sucks. let me figure out what I can do. Who can I talk to? What can I find? Should I talk to the athletes and ask about their opinion? Shocker. Maybe that's something you should do, right? A group think mentality, you know, guys, is there something I'm missing? Do you think there's something wrong? And some of the hardest conversations I've had are with 13-year-old girls, because I asked them directly 4 years ago with me and my partner coach. I was like, this is not working. We're not happy. You're not happy. Something's wrong here. Let's just figure it out. And they told me some of the most painful things I've ever heard, and because it attacked, again, my insecurities at the deepest level. But out of that conversation and discomfort came meaningful progress. And I think everybody listening here who's clearly probably a little upset or unhappy with maybe what's going on now in their life, if they have a problem, like, maybe you should talk to some of your closest friends and be like, is there something that I'm missing that you've wanted to tell me, but you feel awkward because you don't want to hurt my feelings? Like, let's get a cup of coffee and just settle this thing. You know what I mean? That's the best thing you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think more and more people are realizing that just like a simple conversation can do a lot for resolving so much. And I think, you know, if someone is experiencing kind of that like frustration with the world for 3 to 7 months, or even just for a little bit, like if a conversation is not cutting it, therapists are a real thing. And like, there's no reason not to go if that's something that feels helpful.
Yeah.
I wanted to quickly, now that we've kind of talked a little bit about some stuff, just get into kind of who you are for a hot second. Since I would like to open with some convo and then just kind of introduce you. So for people who are listening on my end, Dave Tilley is the owner of Shift Movement Science.
Yep.
And you've been a high-level gymnast in the past. You've coached. You had a journey through physical therapy school. And now, I don't know what term I would use to encompass all the things you do, because you're involved in what seem like more different projects than one person can physically be involved in. But yeah, do you want to just quickly talk about how you describe the world that you live in these days? Yeah,
well, first, that was flattering. I need to hire you for like my hype man. It's like when I walk in a room, you can just like, you know, get some smoke and fog and lights and say that intro. That'd be great. Yeah. So I, as you said, the highlight notes is I did gymnastics up through level 10. I was not a great gymnast. I did collegiate gymnastics at Springfield College, a Division III school, and barely limped onto the team. And I think they felt bad for me. So like if there were cuts, I would have gone, like for sure. But I was lucky enough to stay on the team, got my doctoral degree through PT school there. And then after the fact was working, and I was still coaching gymnastics and enjoying that. So I did my postdoctoral work in sports physical therapy. I got a board certification in that. And then also my strength conditioning degree. So I think it all just kind of came about because one of my inherent qualities, I'm just like a naturally curious person. And I've also, the family that I grew up in and the environment I was around was just deeply rooted in empathy, right? My family is very empathetic. They care a lot about each other, and they would do anything for, you know, their friends, stuff like that. So I kind of, through my social community of gymnastics, very much established strong relationships with like a couple of my best friends, my community was very much the reason I was involved in gymnastics. Like I did enjoy training, I did enjoy that stuff, but I was never one who like loved competing and thrived off of that. Like, not really. I enjoyed the people I was with, the times we had together, like that kind of vibe. I enjoyed like just getting like gritty, hard work, like just crushing ourselves as a team and like making our, like really living up to our potential that way. And so I think that's what kind of got me involved in gymnastics, and why I stayed involved in coaching is because I greatly see gymnastics, but also many of these kind of, like you said, sports where you're not getting paid a lot. It's very hard. Like I put like wrestling and gymnastics and circus and like all these like, you know, like nuanced niche sports that are so hard, that are just so hard, but there's no financial or fame incentive unless you become like an Olympian, right? And even then you're still not getting paid as much as you deserve. But just like the values and the integrity and the character that those sports develop, I personally think are what create human beings that go on to just do unbelievable things for our world. And there's a lot of examples of, you know, again, wrestlers, MMA, gymnastics, circus, people who just learn this gritty mentality that go on to go to college and go on to just do incredible things in the world, whether that's medically, whether that's with businesses, whether that's with just being an amazing parent, whatever it is. So I think that's like, I think there's a very large role for me to play as a coach to help positively inspire the girls that I work with and those around me. But then also with Shift, the reason I started Shift is because I felt I had a valuable opinion to, from the medical provider point of view, from the coaching point of view, and from some of the other stuff, is to just help share information to just reduce the unnecessary suffering that is in the sport, right? It's hard enough as it is. And so is circus, and so is MMA, and so is that stuff. So like there's plenty of challenge already. We don't need to further the challenge with stacking up injuries or mental burnout or fatigue or pushing the little kids when they're not ready for stuff like that. So that was how it all started, was like, this is kind of cool. And then I absolutely 1000% have academic ADD. Like I read a lot of books. I like a lot of articles. Like I'm all over the place. Like I jump topic to topic. And I think, again, I like to pull the threads of my curiosity and follow those things down a rabbit hole for things that are very interesting to me. So gymnastics, and it started out with like just gymnastics, rehab, sports performance, uncovering strength and conditioning and kind of flexibility and all that kind of stuff. And then it morphed into more of the periodization and the global training, and it morphed into stress neuroendocrinology and allostatic load theory and stuff like that. I was like, this is cool. And then it slowly just jumps topic to topic. And like where I'm at now, where you said where I have a lot of my hands in a lot of different projects, are just things that could move the needle in a positive direction to help humans become better humans, but then also enjoy their sport more, right? Or stay involved in the sport. Because there's so many kids that have great potential in sports, whether it's gymnastics, circus, or all these other sports we're talking about, and they get to a point where they could have been great if they didn't have all these injuries, or if they didn't have a coach that was like pushing them way too hard too early, or if they just had better strength and conditioning tools and education around what to do when they hit these common frustration points. And so that's where I feel like if I can write one article or put out one podcast that some random coach in the UK hears that works with 4 people in their gym, but because they know how to help this one athlete with this little pain they have and get them to the right doctor or PT, and that person stays in the sport, and it's the difference between them quitting and staying in the sport and learning all these important life lessons I was lucky to learn from my coach and my friends and my teammates, then that is all worth it. You know what I mean? Like that's definitely it. And so that's kind of my bigger why behind why I do it. I don't care about the money. I could give 2 craps about the whole status and fame thing. Like it's really negligible to me. I just feel as though I'm trying to use this rare opportunity that I have to be someone who has a notable voice, who people value their opinions and listen to the podcast, and to use that opportunity and not have regret when I look back 10 years from now or 20 years from now and be like, I had the chance to make a really positive dent on the world of gymnastics and then vicariously circus, ballet, whatever it is. And I let it fall asleep or let it fall through my hands because I just didn't want to work hard, or because I was just too lazy, or because I, didn't want to sacrifice and put in the work. And so like, I don't want to have that regret. And then it also obviously is a way for me to support myself. And I only started the company because I was paying too much money for books. Like I was losing money in debt. So I was like, I should probably start not bleeding capital. That's a very real story. I spent $10,000 in the first a year of my education after school on like books and stuff like that. And I was like, I should probably not go into debt more for this stuff. So yeah.
I like to read. Please help me pay for the things I read.
Literally that's it.
But it's real though. And I think, like you said, you're sharing as much as you possibly can with everyone who knows about you. And hopefully more and more people are learning about the incredible amount of free and like very affordable resources you put out.
Thank you.
And I know that at least in the circus world, the people that do know about you, I'm not trying to hype you up anymore. I know I already hyped you up, but they're like huge fans.
Okay. I'm flattered.
And so, yeah, I think like people want to support you, and people appreciate what you do, even when they're not directly in the world that you're in.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, again, I don't discredit the amount of work that I put in. Like it's a lot. It's really hard. And people don't see that side of a business. Like they think entrepreneurship and owning a company is like this lavish lifestyle. I just make my own schedule and I can just go wherever I want and I'm rolling in dough. And it's like, no, it's not. It's hard and it's lonely and it's not that financially profitable. Like to run a real company and grow it, you put way more money into the tank to long-term success. And it's just not Friday nights, me by myself, my computer reading research or writing articles or doing lectures. Like that's really what it is. It's me at 5 a.m. before work doing stuff. And so like I do it as a labor of love. But the reason that I feel strongly about putting out so much information is it's twofold. One is it feels good. It's good to give people free stuff that they can actually use. 2 is in a business point of view, the way to have a real business long-term is to support people and build trust and get a community. But 3 is I don't want people to be limited by money and access to information. You know what I mean? Like if there's 1,000 coaches out there, circus and gymnastics alike, who just like, if they just had better information, they'd be so fired up, they'd be so passionate, they'd feel less frustrated, they'd feel super excited, and they'd roll into their gym on a high because they know what to do to help somebody, and that feels good. And so that was a frustration point that I saw in my education growing up as a gymnastics coach. Is it felt very like cloak and dagger is the term, that you had to know this person and be in this inner circle to talk about this special technique. And unless you were like buddy with this person, you couldn't get into this secret meeting. And I was like, dude, this is ridiculous. Like I don't want to be limited by helping my athletes just because I know somebody and that they can get me into this little inner circle to learn. Like that's crazy. And like, don't get me wrong, you should have to pay for high quality education, right? Like I buy very expensive textbooks to try to get the latest stuff. And I'm not afraid to ask somebody to pay some money to a course that I spent 150 hours on. It's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the ludicrous amount of money people ask for some basic information, and how much they expect someone to bend over backwards and bow down to them as an ego thing again. So that happened when I wrote like the bigger book that a lot of people found me for. Was I was just like watching the scandal unfold, and I was watching all these things happen, and I realized that a root source of a lot of this misery was some people having information and holding on to it as a power dynamic, and not being willing to share unless you paid an ungodly amount of money or unless you were in this special social circle. So I was like, all right, screw it. I'll take everything I've ever learned and all the books that I have access to and all the mentors I've been lucky to have. It's not my information. I got taught by other people, and let me just put it out for free online. And if the only thing standing beside it is you wanting to work hard, that's your problem, right? Like here's a 500-page book with all the things you could figure out. Here's 95 lectures on YouTube. It's up to you whether you want to learn it or not. And if you don't want to do it, then that's a different conversation. But if you do want to learn it, have at it, right? And then the courses that I have and the stuff that I offer online is like, if you'd like to be a part of a community that talks about this stuff and can answer some questions, which is hard to do in a book format, or you have more nuanced things, or you're hitting a problem that you'd like to have help with, or if you want to learn how I do things, if you want to learn how I treat people's hip injuries or people's stuff like that, then like, cool, like here's a course for it. You can pay it and go for it. But if you just want the information, go nuts. It's all yours.
Yeah. You mentioned this a little bit earlier, kind of wanting to share different tools that you thought would help athletes, gymnasts, dancers, circus artists in this case, that would help them kind of like break through plateaus, overcome that frustration, prevent injury. Would you be open to just touching on kind of your thoughts on the benefits of kind of programmed weight training, resistance training to augment aerial circus?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny in the gymnastics world. I actually, in the podcast today that I had out, was Scott Wilgris, who is, anyone's familiar with gymnastics, Ellie Black strength coach, who was like one of the more spotlighted people who was she's been weightlifting for 10 years since she was 16, 2011, before the first cycle of her Olympic quad. And so she's now in her third Olympic cycle going into it. And she has clearly been successful as an all-around gymnast. But she's worked with Scott, that coach, strength coach, doing what everyone else thought was like, completely sacrilegious for the last 10 years, having great success. So we had a long conversation about this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's the science is pretty clear. The anecdotal evidence is pretty clear. I don't think there's a debate that it's not helpful. I think the problem in the way that it came about was a misapplication of the tool that gave some people a bad experience. And there's definitely some strength coaches who probably shouldn't be working with gymnasts because they don't understand the sport. Or they don't understand how to program safely for gymnasts to get lean body mass and work on the very specific body strength type things that they need to get down to. But the physiological evidence is pretty clear that weight training helps towards the end goal of explosive body weight power, or to build capacity, especially in the upper body, to handle hanging stuff like that. So in your world, there's only so much loading you can do from a body weight point of view to build capacity before you plateau, because it's only your body weight. You know what I mean? Like you can't get any stronger, nor can you tolerate more heavy traction forces unless you have something that's more than your body weight. And so I see a lot in the circus world of people who are doing very high volume and very high loading traction forces on their shoulder, and they say, I'm just completely making a number. They weigh 130 pounds, right? And they only have ever trained with 130 pounds their entire life, but they do a drop or they do some sort of skill or routine and they're bouncing very hard at end range. I promise you that is more than 130 pounds in ground reaction forces. So like, okay, well, how do you train that? Force is here, right? And your capacity is here. And every time you try to do these harder skills or longer routines, you break down, your shoulders hurt and you feel like garbage, right? So what do? Well, you either pull down the forces and you don't do harder skills. That's not fun. Or you have to increase your capacity. So the way you do that is you get some weightlifting involved. You do some single arm, weighted pull-ups. You do some different rowing variations. You take care of your cuff. You have to grow your rotator cuff to handle the high traction force skills it wasn't designed for from a hypertrophy point of view. So that's some light dumbbell work. I think the problem is that people hear weightlifting and think bodybuilding and like muscle beach. They don't think about like very new school science-based functional strength and conditioning for what their sport demands, which is what we kind of specialize in at Champion is tailoring those things to people based on their needs. And I think the other one that commonly comes up too is like with handstand training, right? Like if your goal is to do very aggressive single arm handstand work down the road, well, that's more than your body weight on one arm. That's like your entire body weight stacked on one arm. And rarely do you do things that train for that. So, a half kneeling dumbbell press is 1/30th of a handstand pushup. So if you have one arm that's kind of weak, or you have one, side of your body that's not as strong as the other, that's not performing well, maybe you can clear up that asymmetry with some half kneeling dumbbell presses or something of that nature. Or maybe it's just your neck is sore one day and you still want to work on your handstand progressions and you can't do it. Maybe doing half kneeling dumbbell presses with some Turkish get-ups and overhead carries can replicate what the demand is on your shoulder without making your neck sore. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, right? Like just doing this skill over and over and over again is not going to get you the thing you need. There's a lot of components to circus training on traction forces and overhead forces, whether that's flexibility and mobility, whether that's just grunt strength of your rotator cuff and your scap in your shoulder girdle, whether that's dynamic stability or whether that's, a million other things, endurance for whatever you're doing. There's a lot of different factors and athletic qualities you can train in the weight room and develop the qualities you need and then funnel them into the gymnastic specific or circus specific thing that you're trying to get at. So yeah, there's I don't want to belabor the geekiness of the points, but there's clear evidence that it works physiologically. There's clear performance benefits that we see. And I think anyone who has a good strength coach who can help them with a realistic programming sees the benefits. And it just comes down to, again, of unknowns, like fear of the unknown, not having the education. Change is very uncomfortable and learning something takes work. And so like changing your methods and having to learn a lot and have to have an open mind is being humble enough to admit you don't know it all, but also maybe somebody else knows more than you, which is why the gymnastics world has a problem with it, because God forbid a strength coach did the strength programming and you weren't the coach doing that, because maybe you didn't get a 4-year master's in that, and so that's kind of where it comes down to is like being humble and willing to say, okay, I know a lot about gymnastics coaching. I know a lot about circus training. I know a lot about skills. I don't know a lot about physical preparation. I don't know a lot about nutrition. I don't know a lot about mental health, and physical therapy injuries. So like, who are the people on my team that I can build around me to either ask and learn more, which is what I did with strength and conditioning. Is I for 2 years, I very much just hired people and learned from them. And then I got my strength and conditioning degree, or just outsource and delegate to them and be willing to work on a team and not just be the hero.
Yeah. I think accepting that we don't wear every hat is key to using what we actually add in terms of value appropriately and not pretending we add value in areas we don't.
Sure.
Quick question. So I think some people listening might have thoughts or questions about like, is resistance training or strength training appropriate for something like contortion, where the dynamic loads aren't necessarily as high, but there are still strength components that are very relevant, at least from my perspective. Mm-hmm. Have you thought about that at all? Or
yeah, no, definitely. And I have worked with very lax hypermobile people who kind of make their money, so to speak, on their hypermobility. You know what I mean? And I think, again, this comes down to not having a myopic view of what strength and conditioning is and realizing that within a program, you can make very specific programming based on the goals you have, right? So like, yeah, if you're a power lifter, then your strength conditioning weight room session is going to look very different than someone who's a contortionist or extremely hypermobile. That being said, if you have a good strength coach who understands the variety of different exercises and tools that you can use, you can build a program that is very specific to the goals that you have in contortion or in hypermobility based things, like especially ballet, right? And stuff like that. It just has to come down to what the end goal is. what your individual anatomy allows and stuff like that, and where you can find it. So for someone who's in more contortionate, it would be less about the larger lifts and less about the, big power end of the spectrum of like 3RMs and stuff like that maybe like a gymnast might work up to for power, rate of force, explosive development, or even someone who's, say, for example, like a trampolinist that I have friends that are in circ for trampoline and high bar and stuff. Their program is going to be very different. Like one of my friends was in sear wheel, right? And another one of his friends was in teeter board, and very different training styles, right? Someone who has a completely different skill profile. But the person who was doing trampolining and the person who was doing teeter board and stuff, like, you get rocked in ground reaction forces. And if you don't know how to handle those, you're going to die. So you actually are appropriate for some heavier back squats, some heavier trap bar deadlifts, some split squats, right? Whereas the contortionist doesn't have to handle those ground reaction forces. That being said, they do have to handle extreme ranges of motion and high levels of dynamic stability and cuff control. So a lot of like tempo, pause, eccentrics and elongated range of motion would be great for them, right? Like we're often giving higher level gymnasts who have beam and beam and floor specialists like extended range of motion split squats. So front and rear footed elevated split squats with a 5-second lower and a 2-second pause, which if you've never felt death before, do a few sets of those. But it very much replicates the very end range of a split pelvis position they need for their gymnastics demands of a switch leap or a switch ring or something like that. So that's an example that might be carry over well to someone with contortionist. They have extreme straddle ranges of motion, eccentric Cossack squats to a very low depth, right? And getting some loading at end range there might be very helpful to build capacity at end range of motion when they're very much teetering on the line of something that's going to be dangerous to their hip joint or to their back. And then on the next piece is like that person also just needs, they're so hypermobile, their static stability is so compromised, right? They don't have inherent stability of their glenohumeral ligaments and their hip capsules to handle some of these extreme ranges of motion, that they need to practice that dynamic stability at end range. So doing a basic cuff and hip circuit regularly will help keep their deeper muscles that are stabilizing the hip joint intact to not damage their labrum or stuff like that. But they should be training some of those end ranges with more dynamic stability, things of that nature. And there's great strength conditioning programs that could do all of the things you need, right? Like 2-point pause, turkish get-ups through every point of motion. Arm bars are a phenomenal thing to give to anybody who's working in circus for overhead anything, handstands, contortion, whatever else it is, right? Same thing on the lower body. Those extended range of motion split squats, deeper pistols, right? Like all that kind of stuff that we know can be loaded. It's just a matter of finding the right avenue to load that person and finding a strength coach who understands the unique demands of their subset of circus training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like the idea of those kind of elevated end range split squats. Just in general,
horrific.
I'm like,
they're terrible.
I want to do those. They sound awful. Yeah, I think what you're saying in terms of it's the resistance and strength training is always going to be relevant to the discipline or apparatus is really crucial, because there are definitely ideas that if you do a certain type of circus skill, and maybe it's similar in gymnastics, that you don't ever want to do any type of like resistance training. But like you said, anecdotally, and the research indicates that that resistance training is probably going to increase your skill acquisition and reduce your risk of injury in the long run.
Yeah, there's 3 main myths and misunderstandings of why people do it. They want to think they're going to lose their flexibility, it's going to make them bulky, and they're going to get hurt. That's like, I've never heard a different reason to not do it. And the research is pretty clear on all those things, especially with not only a short-term strength training. Yes, you're going to get DOMs, you're going to get some micro tearing, you will be stiff, but eccentric training long-term is one of the only things we know that actually does increase muscle length, hopefully over time with sarcomere versus, stretching and regular mobility training is probably more neural. It's probably just desensitizing some of the nociceptors and making things like more stretch discomfort tolerance. And then injuries, there's an abundance of evidence that says that strength training actually does help reduce the risk of injury when properly done, and that the only injuries they usually have in those studies are people with terrible technique or terrible programming, or who have like accidentally dropped a weight on their foot when they're in the strength trim. You know what I mean? So that can't be counted against us. And then getting bulky is way more of a function of nutrition and rest to recovery ratios and what you're doing with recovery and the total volume you're doing. Like, yes, if you 1 RM and top end strength, a 5x1 back squat, that is probably how you'll gain some hypertrophy. And I have friends that are very, very high level, elite level weightlifters. And when you hear about what they do to add bulk, because they need more mass to move more mass, when you hear about the things they do, like back squatting 3 times per week, eating 7,000 calories, like that kind of stuff, it's like, meh, and so anyone who is interested in more of that, you can actually listen to the Scott Wilgert episode. He talks about like working in 6 to 10 rep ranges that are not like gassing someone to failure to build a lot of mass, nutritional strategies, stuff like that. Like there's a way to go about this in an interdisciplinary way with nutrition and strength training and proper programming and exercise selection, right? That's not going to cause an extended amount of mass to be built. And you can kind of stay in that more of that optimal body composition.
Yeah. Just something that I'm maybe you haven't thought about this, but when we're talking about like lean mass versus getting a little bit bigger, a lot of circus folk, I think, are kind of into the idea of intermittent fasting, and there's new evidence coming out about it all the time. One recent study that came out indicated that all other things kind of being up to the person who's doing intermittent fasting, where they're eating within that less 8-hour window, the primary thing they saw was weight loss, but it was lean muscle mass that they were losing, not anything else. And I was like, probably that's a relevant point, but we'll see. Probably more research needs to be done.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not an expert in nutrition, but I have dabbled a lot in intermittent fasting, and I always have tried stuff with myself before people ask me about it. And my buddy Dan Pope has looked a lot of this nutritional research, and like you wonder if IF is actually just a caloric deficit. You know what I mean? Like you just eat less in a less window. Like there's only so much you can eat in one meal setting before you get full. So it might be a caloric deficit. But from my understanding of the literature now is that most of it surrounds wellness benefits and, some definitely like, holistic health and stuff like that, which is good. There are some, I think, endurance benefits in the longer windows of a restricted eating time and a smaller feeding window. But it's really, really hard to make the argument that for a short burst anaerobic sport that, operating on no fuel and no glycogen is going to be a better thing, So I'm not an expert in this, but I haven't seen any explosive power athlete that I work with at an elite level, like jump on intermittent fasting and stay. It's the best thing they ever did. They usually feel like garbage because they just don't have power to support the needs they do. And they're often training twice a day. So I don't know if you're into more like the recreational side of gymnastics or circus and you're trying to optimally get some body changes, or you want to feel better or maybe sleep better, might be a good idea for you. And I've done almost every version of fasting that I thought was empirically relevant. So I did 8, 12, 14, 16, 20-hour feeding windows for like over the course of like 2 months. I also did a 24 and a 48 and a 72-hour direct fast. And then I also did a fasting mimicking diet. And none of those were great. I think like the lower end of an 8 to 16 window was like sustainable if I had health goals, but I mean, I'm trying to work out pretty consistently. I'm lifting pretty heavy weight. And I can tell you for a fact, trying to do 5x5 back squats when you're fasted versus when you're not, or when you're just after a feeding window is very, very different than a sustainable, like healthy kind of glycogen, normal distribution diet. So my personal evidence, N of 1, but I think the nutritionists that I work with would probably agree.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm on board. I could not do it at all. And I am excited to see more research around it for athletes that are kind of in the fields that we exist in. I'm aware we're getting close to the end of our time. So I was curious. We had talked a little bit earlier. I sent you that email about the FMS and kind of earlier on in your career. I know that you used it, and I think there's like a blog post or an article from way back when where you referenced it. And then a friend of mine actually is in physical therapy school here in Flagstaff, Arizona, where they did some research on it. And just in the small sample size, like N of 160, it wasn't predictive of injury rates, and the asymmetries weren't actually correlated with, injurious outcomes. This, with the caveat of, it was only not predictive for like chronic overuse injuries for non-contact sports. So a contact injury that wasn't included in there. But what's your perspective on it, and what do you use now to like predict injury for your athletes?
Yeah. So two things. One is you can't predict an injury. Let's just get that out of the way. Like there's no research that's predicted any injury, right? Unless you plan to run into another human as hard as you can. Like that's probably going to be a way to predict an injury, like football. But yeah, this story arc of me with the FMS and the SFMA follows what everybody else probably does and what you should do, which is a new tool comes out. It seems interesting. You wait for the literature to develop a little bit. You don't jump on the bandwagon early, but the literature came out. They're like, maybe we're onto something here. It seems intriguing. I learned the SFMA as well early in my career, which was very, very helpful. And at first, we thought maybe there'd be something there to see who could maybe be at risk for more injury. I don't know. And I've talked with Gray a few times. I went to his functional capacity course. He invited me to like do some stuff. I've never heard Gray say that the FMS predicts injury. I don't know if that's something that was taken out of context from what he said. I think he's always said it's a way to use as a window and a marker to look at who might be at risk for more, right? If someone is doing a sport that demands deep squatting, like Olympic lifting, but they can't do a bodyweight squat, that might be more concerning for someone. I don't think he's ever said that the total score is going to cause injuries under. I think it's just correlative data. So I could be wrong on that. Maybe there's an archive of Gray saying that, but to my knowledge, no. And yeah, I started out with using the FMS and the SFMA as a way to assess people. And I don't think I ever had the interpretation that if you scored under something or over something, you were more or less at risk to get injured. I've always used it in the context of this is a way to quickly get a snapshot of how somebody is moving to say, is there a notable issue that we should look at, a pain or someone who can't do a basic movement pattern that their sport demands, right? So for me, I think that it captures a few things, but not all. And I think like jumping and landing is a perfect example for gymnastics, right? Like if somebody can't land in a basic bodyweight squat, because their ankles are super stiff or their back hurts, and like that's probably something we should be warranting more investigation for. But yeah, I've never looked at somebody with like a 1-3 inline lunge and been like, oh, you're definitely going to hurt yourself. You know what I mean? Like that's never been something I thought about. And so I used it early in my career as a way to help start bridging the gap back to a strength and conditioning program about like, okay, now that you're cleared, let's do a basic movement screen and some other more functional tests of jumping and running and landing to see if you're maybe ready to start or return to sport progress. With the thought being that if you can't do basic movement patterns and basic, strength tests, then you're probably not going to have a good course when you go back to your sport fully. So that was always my take on it. And I have moved into more comprehensive assessments, I guess. It's not the way to say it. Not that I don't use a lunge and a squat and that kind of stuff, but there's some things in the FMS that aren't checked out. And again, I think Gray would be the first to tell you that it's a very small piece of his overall assessment. And so we have developed at Champion when I work. We took all of the stuff that we believe in from the SFMA, FMS, McKenzie, all of Mike's experience, all Lenny's experiences, all of Dan and my experiences, and the other Mike Scaduto and Lisa, who I work with, and we all just put our heads together and said, like, what do we think is important for all athletes generally to do? And we have a variation of our performance system that is like, on the medical side is cervical, shoulder, some McKenzie stuff, toe touch, bend back, twist, push up, reverse pull, single leg squat, step down, which is not in the FMS, and some other stuff. And so we just kind of created our own melting pot of all these different systems that we believe in. And we use that. And then we have an abundance of medical tests that we do, and I think the perfect example is the discrepancy between like a baseball player's shoulder and a circus or gymnast person's shoulder is like, there are some things that are very important to look at that the FMS would not, or the SFMA would not. Like total arc range of motion, for example, is very helpful and very important in cross-body adduction in a baseball player, but those things are not as relevant for a circus artist or a gymnast. So maybe we're looking more at like shoulder hyperflexion and scaption and some other stuff there. That probably is more important to us. And so I think that it got molded into just a general movement assessment, which is what we do now. And then we do our own medical assessments, which we believe is pretty helpful. But in terms of like predicting injury, I don't know. There's nothing that can predict an injury. It's a moving target at all costs. But I always believe in open communication and just asking how someone feels and talking about that is number one. Number two is I always look at periodization and strength and conditioning research of how you plan your training. And are you using well evidence-based periodized models of light, medium, heavy, and planning blocks and planning rest times and that kind of stuff? I do believe that basic wellness monitoring is very important. Like, how did you sleep? How do you feel? Give me a number 1 to 10. We can add that up and get a wellness score with like sleep, mood, all that kind of stuff.
To train type thing.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So those things are always more simple but intuitive. But then also like with I've been fortunate to do some work with Tim Gabbett, and like I think the workload research is, again, has criticism with acute to chronic workload ratios, and I think Tim would be the first to admit it's not perfect statistically, but again, having a plan of how you measure workload in your sport, like tracking how many miles you run, or tracking how many times you do certain skills in circus, or tracking how many, like, RPE measures you can take. Like I follow more of just like the communication, have a plan, maybe some workload and wellness stuff, and then having some sort of, open feedback loop for making new ideas. And then again, just proper training, strength conditioning, basic principles of human physiology, like those things for me, and not being an idiot with your training, are probably better than some crazy metric of advanced movement screening and biomechanics. But then, yeah, we look at everything else. We look at running, jumping, landing, sprint tests, windows, all that kind of stuff that our strength coaches do. And we kind of make a holistic profile. So I'm not sure if I actually said anything meaningful there, but that's where my brain went.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did. I think you clarified that like no one measure is going to cover all of what you need to look at in hold on one sec. No one measure is going to cover all of what you need to look at in an athlete, especially like the FMS. I think did a little bit get a reputation of like, okay, this is going to be used in this way, but really it's like a short, clinical, efficient like screening tool, and it's not meant to be this like massive, all-encompassing thing. Yeah, I think the reason why I ask is because in the circus world, if you go into like a recreational studio, there's a lot of discussion around, oh, well, I have this slight imbalance or this asymmetry. And, there are some people who, train on one side because they're performing in one arm all the time. And there are some people who get really, really worried that like their asymmetry is going to lead to injury, either in an acute or chronic sense. And I think, like you said, we can't predict that. The training load and the progression and the periodization probably has as much to play or more to play than, oh, my left arm has 10 or 5 degrees more flexion than my right arm.
Sure.
I'm with that.
But anyway, on that point, it's important, because I think that what you have to realize here is, do you have ways to measure what you need to do for your sport, right? That's really what you need to do, is like, do you have tools and systems and screenings to look at? Do you have overhead mobility? Do you have enough split hip flexibility? Do you have enough shoulder strength? So like for circus people, like getting some sort of screening tool, which is what we do at Champion, which is like overhead motion, ER, IR, strength testing with a dynamometer, like just basic stuff like that. You do want to keep measures of that. And so that's what I found, is like being able to do a general movement screen is good, but also like strength declines or non-functional overreaching with like declines in performance, or just like not recovering well. Your sleep is like trash. You don't feel good. Like wellness markers, those are probably better. I do see a lot of people in gymnastics and circus and everywhere in the strength conditioning world just getting completely paralyzed by a small asymmetry they have, and like really going too far down the weeds, I think, with like, well, I have this imbalance and this dynamic stability thing, and like I'm not going to have this activation pattern of my left middle trap, and so that's going to cause me to have a handstand issue. And it's like, whoa, I don't think any research has ever shown that. And also, like, I think you're getting overcomplicated here. Like, just keep the basics, do the basics really, really well. Do I have mobility? Do I have a good strength program? Am I monitoring my training? Do I have workload measurements? Do I have really good basics in technique? Do I practice that every day? You have to remember that one is we're built inherently asymmetrical, and that some of the best athletes in the world are asymmetrical. Usain Bolt has one of the worst leg raise differences in the entire world. Are you going to change his straight leg raise because he has an asymmetry? Probably not. You know what I mean? So like those little things are there. And I think with baseball, for example, we measure external and elevation. We know that if you lose elevation, you're at more increased risk down the road of an elbow injury. It was correlated with more long-term elbow issues. In gymnastics, I see it all the time, that losses in overhead elevation as you train more do bring about some more extension-based back pain. And I've seen that in circus people as well, that train a ton of scarves and a ton of hanging stuff like that. And they do over time lose their overhead mobility, so they get neck pain or back pain. Again, it's correlative data, but like that's more what you should be looking at, is like, am I getting and maintaining full mobility? My strength is there. I'm going through rest of work cycles. Look more at the simple rocks of that kind of stuff. And then, am I sleeping enough? Am I eating well? Am I drinking enough water? Do I take time away from training? Like if those 4 things aren't in place, then, the 4 extra degrees of elevation loss you have in your inability to activate your scap is probably not the biggest low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I think the basics, it just always goes back to the basics, and the idea that humans have the capacity to adapt to quite a lot of different things.
It's way more boring. Way more boring and way more tedious, but it's really what the most elite athletes do.
But you don't feel like a cool detective.
No, and it's definitely not sexy on social media. Doing basic sleeping habits and, very, very basic, boring strength work for your shoulder is not nearly as cool on Instagram.
It's true. I just want to be mindful of your time. I know it's been about an hour. If you have more time, I had one more question for you. If not, no stress.
Fire away, man.
All right. This is a kind of broad one because we've touched on some of the areas that I was interested in. Well, okay, you can choose. I either was curious about your idea of, or your perspective on microdosing with fear, and then almost imagining periodizing for fear and like a fear or cognitive RPE, which is something that's been like moving around in my brain recently, or just anything else that you think would be interesting research that would apply to circus or aerial, or things that you've seen in your clients, athletes, or patients that you think people would benefit from hearing that we haven't touched on.
Yeah, I think they can be two in the same, because I do think that's something that I think a lot about, and I've seen a lot of people who have injuries, performance issues, whatever else, does come down to, why you're training and what your goals are and what you want to do versus what you think you should do, what you're worried about your friends thinking, you're worried about, social media, whatever it is. I think in generally, the thing that most people can benefit from is self-awareness and a lot of time figuring out what they really want and what's going to make them most happy. And yeah, that concept of microdosing fear, back to actually original question or answer you had, was talking about seeing a therapist, is I'm kind of split. I like to read my way through some problems and kind of journal and think about things, but I also did see a therapist that was very, very helpful for me to kind of grapple with a framework for a lot of what I was going through. And a lot of the thought process that I had around what I was doing with my career, what my training looked like, what I was worried about in terms of like my own personal life and insecurities and fears that I had about, like, from a younger coach being egotistical and being insecure and taking out on the kids and that kind of whole wrap up. But then also on the other side about just being, working in my field and worrying about, like, am I spending too much time working? Am I missing out on family life? Should I spend more time chilling out? Like, I had this weird mixture of, don't miss the opportunity to help a lot of people and make shift become a big thing. And also maybe I'm missing out on quality time with my friends and my family and, finding someone and getting married and having a family. Like, maybe I'm missing out. And like, there's so much pressure in society to do that thing, to be like, oh, you're 30, time to do this. Or like, you're 35, you should have a job like that you are passionate about, or like all like supposed to bullshit, to be honest. Like I think people are paralyzed by supposed to life and society telling you this, or your friends telling you this, and like keeping up with the Joneses is something like Gary Vee says, like, no one's on a path that's completely found out and knows. Like, I really believe in ironing out your values and trying to figure out what it is you want and trying to really put those in the forefront. And I think this all comes back to the concept of graded exposure is really at the base of a lot of like cognitive behavioral therapy, and then also acceptance and commitment therapy, which were both very valuable to me. And so I think it really does come down to understanding and being willing to admit the things that scare you the most, that you're the most insecure about, whether that's fear of rejection if you're in a dating relationship, or whether that's in the fear of financial insecurity if you're going through coronavirus, like, or you're worried about, not having a job, you feel lost because you're like, I don't know what I want to do with my life, and you feel depressed and maybe lonely in coronavirus. Like, there's a million options here you could pick from, the platter of misery. But I'm going to use that term, the platter of misery. It sounds terrible, but the buffet of sadness, right? But I think that I think a lot of people all have their own contextualized fears. And so I think it's really important that you dig down into, with a therapist or on your own, to figure out what is the thing I'm the most terrified of? What is the thing I'm the most scared of? And at one point in my life, it was, financial insecurity. At another point in my life, it was personal relationships and romantic partners. Another part in my life, it was running a company and having it possibly tank, when I coronavirus, stuff like that. So there's layers, but you figure out, okay, what am I most terrified of? What is scary the most? And you have to find values to anchor to that get you through those moments of palms sweating. Don't want to do it. I'd rather hide under the covers. I don't want to work out today. I don't want to do my banking because I hate my accounting stuff. I don't want to go to this conversation that I know is going to be uncomfortable, like all this kind of stuff, all the things that are very anxiety provoking for humans. And I've found that when you have those values really outlined of what your ideal version of yourself and your ideal vision of the future, what do I want to be? Who do I want to be? What do I value? What are my goals? And also, what do I want my future to look like? Whether that's owning a gym, whether that's having something skill, whether that's being financially free, whether that's, having an amazing wife or husband or partner or whoever it is in a family, maybe that's your goal as a human, whatever it is. If you have those values outlined, you then can make a plan about how to get to that. And those steps are microdosing fear, microdosing yourself to fear, choosing to take the harder, longer, less exciting path, right? That is usually based and anchored to virtues over letting vices rule your life, right? And that's kind of something I've talked a lot about in my podcast is not using alcohol or junk food or social media or TV or the abundance of other things that you could do to numb yourself and escape your problems and hide from the world and deal with that. You have to choose voluntarily to not take that path and instead choose the harder path. And that was the only way that I found myself get out of some mental health disorder issues and some other problems that I had, was understanding and accepting the reality of the situation and saying, this really sucks. Some of the things that have happened to me are unfair. Probably you could make that argument, in that are hard, but not playing the victim and not letting yourself wallow in it and say, I'm just going to choose every day to do the harder things I need to do to get towards the goals that I have for myself and my ideal future, which honestly involves every single day microdosing yourself with some sort of discomfort, whether that's physical training or emotional discomfort or having that harder conversation or finally asking out that boy or girl who is, on your mind or something like that, or finally having to, make that big paycheck to chew out the cost for owning a gym or something like that. You know what I mean? But as you microdose yourself with fear, you bank confidence, you bank, being, oh, wow, I didn't know I could do that, but now I can. And then you take another step and then another step and then another step. Some people that's performance anxiety with training. Some people that's on the other side of it. But that's where the whole concept comes from, is trying to follow a virtues over vices approach, whereas you're going to choose every day to do the harder thing and try to chip away at what you believe in is your goal, instead of kind of sliding downhill into the vices, which is very easy to do in our current landscape of coronavirus. But with that mentality of accepting your situation, but realizing you're the author of your own story when it all comes down to it. No one's coming to save you. You can have support from your friends, but no one's going to swoop in like Superman or Superwoman and pick up all your miseries and make your life easier. That's just not how it works, right? And it's never going to get easier. I tell that a lot to the girls that I coach. I say, I hate to break it to you, but it's not going to get easier. You're going to get better at it, but then there's another set of problems for you to deal with, and that's what we all deal with. It's always hard. It's always challenging, and you deserve to be rewarded when you do work hard, but there's always a new set of problems. So you have to kind of forge that mentality of voluntarily walking towards the things that scare you the most, right? Like looking your demons in the eyes and figuring those things out and finding resources to cope in a healthy way, but then also just trying to every day chip away at those things that are valuable to you. So that's, I guess, where that concept comes from. And it's what I found is really beneficial. The only thing that I ever actually had get me out of some very tough times was accepting the shitty things that I don't want to deal with and doing them anyways. And also having, again, those values to anchor with and those future visions of what I want to anchor with, realizing like, okay, this is hard. And it's very easy to do the easier thing and escape reality and numb yourself or run away with TV or whatever, but you're going to be regretful. And I think regretful is the biggest driver of fear that a lot of people have down the road. You don't want to wake up and be like, oh my God, I can't believe I let it slip away, or I'm miserable right now because I chose the wrong thing. And it's very hard to do in a society that goes downhill the other way. Oftentimes there's a million ways that you could ignore your problems. But I think that's what it comes down to, is trying to wake up every day and build a schedule around it. And the last parting thought is, it's really hard to do that when people around you are not doing that. And so you have to consciously construct an environment or a social circle of people who are believing in what you do. But I've lost a lot of friends or chosen to stop being around certain people because they're toxic and they're negative, and it hurt in the time. But you have to find a way to really block out the noise and tunnel vision and kind of take a me versus me for me mentality, not me versus everybody else, in a comparison mindset, or in a, like, oh, if that person has one thing it takes away from me. That's not what it goes about to. And so I believe in just quietly chipping away at your issues and what you have to do, and letting your success try to make all the noise for you rather than kind of floating it around as much as you can. So that's a very long answer, but I think it's important because I think that most people have those problems. They don't have problems in their training. They have problems with fears and insecurities and mental health and depression and loneliness right now and financial worries. And I'm still actively crawling uphill against those things, but I've definitely been through a roller coaster the last 5 years owning a company and having gone through the stuff that we've gone through. So hopefully that helps people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. I think that the idea of kind of facing your discomfort and microdosing with fear is what hopefully will work towards making the world just like a better place for individuals and as a community and society, and probably will have carry over to people's individual training. I mean,
Yeah.
so
Most athletes have no problem on the physical side. They're willing to physically be in discomfort. I think most people struggle with the mental and the emotional discomfort. That kind of stuff is more hard. So if you're an athlete who has no problem with that, that's what happened for me. Is I actually started with like more physical versions of this, of doing workouts. Like I would literally be like, what's the worst workout I could do right now? And how am I going to double that, right? And the famous example I have is I was doing a lot of CrossFit at one time, and I was like, I really hate thrusters, I really hate sled pushes, and I really hate running. And so I doubled my workout at heavy thrusters, heavy sled pushes. Then I ran outside in the snow, and that was a 25-minute workout. And I was like, that took my soul at the end of it. But I was like, if I can do that, I can definitely face the emotional discomfort of talking to a now ex-girlfriend about a hard conversation about this is not working out, or I can talk to my mom about something that she's going through. I can talk to my coworkers about this. Nobody's happy here. We need to figure this out. Like I think the physical dosing of discomfort, along with the exercise benefits, gives a lot of athletes the platform to be like, okay, if I can take that, I can definitely take this hard conversation with my spouse, or I can take this really awkward, I don't want to do this financial thing. I don't want to do these accounting books. I think for me personally, it was the other. Some people go the other side. Some people are more academic and mental and emotional, and they can be like, okay, if I can deal with mental and emotional stress, I can start working out. But I think for most people on this podcast, it's the other way. So I have used very hard physical training as a way to get through uncomfortable situations and teach myself that if I can get through that, I can get through this. And then, okay, if I can get through that, I can get through this, right? And I've not going to go into the other things that I've done. I've done some pretty horrific things physically to kind of callous myself towards mentally being able to handle running a company and dealing with kids that are going through a scandal and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think you're probably right. Most athletes are more able to challenge themselves physically. Well, I feel like we covered a lot of different subjects, from practical ideas and tools to the culture and psychological aspects of gymnastics, aerial, and circus.
You just witnessed the manifestation of academic ADD.
I think it's great. I think people, probably anyone listening will get something out of at least one of the topics we covered.
Good, yeah.
And if not all of them. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning. I guess it's about close to your midday,
yeah.
Dave. And for folks who want to check out pretty much all of the amazing stuff that you have, would you recommend they head to your website first, YouTube, Instagram? I mean,
yeah,
you're prolific in the platform, so.
Yeah, I think it's kind of based on your interest, right? So like obviously if you're more on the training side, like the social aspect is going to be where you probably get exercises, ideas, videos. So the blog is pretty popular. The podcast is very popular. But YouTube has an abundance of exercise videos and also interviews and stuff like that. Usually Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and the blog is like content. That's where I pump out all my content. And then usually more of the other nuanced stuff of like emails or more about updates and stuff like that. But we do have, a bunch of stuff online. We have a membership group that if you're curious about learning, it's more gymnastics based, but there's membership stuff, there's courses, if you don't want to spend any money and you're in financial tough, just like look at all the YouTube videos and get all the stuff for free. That's fine too.
Yeah. And for people who are listening, the website is shiftmovementscience.com.
Yep.
And Instagram is, you can Shift Movement Science with Dave Tilley.
Shift Movement Science pretty much everywhere on all the handles.
Sweet. Well, yeah, thanks for hopping on Circus. And it's been a pleasure. Yeah.
It's my pleasure, Aaron. Thanks so much for having me. And I hope that people enjoyed the episode.